A racist and corrupt police officer tried to steal a newborn baby from a black woman in the hospital, but within seconds, her husband, a high-ranking CIA chief, burst through the door. And what happened next shook the entire hospital to its core. It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of her life. The day she brought her first child into the world. Hours of labor, exhaustion flooding every inch of her body, yet the moment she heard that first cry, she forgot the pain. The nurse placed the baby on her chest, warm and soft, and in that instant, nothing else mattered. She whispered his name for the first time, tears sliding down her face, chest rising and falling with disbelief that something so pure had come from inside her. But bliss can be fragile. And for her, it lasted less than a day. The hospital room was quiet. Too quiet. Her husband had left to grab something to eat from the cafeteria. She was alone. Still sore, still hooked up to machines. Her baby sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her. Then, the door opened. He walked in with confidence. Not rushed. Not hesitant. The kind of walk that made people assume he belonged. His police uniform was perfectly pressed, the badge on his chest gleaming. He barely looked at her before stepping straight toward the baby. She blinked. Confused. Tired. "Wait, who are you?" she asked, trying to sit up. The man didn't answer. He reached down and placed his hand on the handle of the bassinet. "What are you doing?" she asked, louder now. He looked her dead in the eyes and said, "There's been a situation. We have orders to take the child for a security check." Her heart stopped. "A security check? What are you talking about?" "That's my son." The man didn't flinch. "I'm not going to argue with you, ma'am. I'm here for the baby." She screamed. Her voice cracked in panic. "He's my baby. You don't get to just take him." The officer's tone dropped, his face tightening with coldness. "You people always make it harder than it has to be. You people." Her world spun. There was a weight to those words. Not just prejudice. Not just racism. But entitlement. Cruelty. Power. He didn't see a mother. He saw a black woman alone in a hospital bed. Powerless. Broken. He didn't know she had a husband. He didn't know who she was married to. All he saw was a chance. She reached for the bassinet, dragging her four behind her, body aching from the cesarean. "Please, don't. Please, don't touch him." Her voice cracked again. She was crying now. But he didn't care. He grabbed the handles and began pulling the bassinet toward the door. That's when a nurse walked in, and paused. "Officer, what's going on?" the nurse asked, her face pale with concern. The cop turned, calm and certain. "Medical emergency. The child needs to be transported for safety reasons. Orders from the top." The nurse frowned. "But I didn't, do you want to get written up?" he snapped. The nurse fell silent. And the mother watched it all. Watched how fast trust could be weaponized against her. How a badge and a uniform could silence doubt. The nurse looked at her, unsure, torn between instinct and authority. She screamed again. "That's my son. Don't let him take him." But no one moved. No one helped. The man pulled the bassinet farther toward the door. And then, the door exploded open. The air shifted instantly. In stepped a man in a black suit. No hesitation in his stride. No doubt in his eyes. Just fire. The woman sobbed out, "Baby, he's trying to take him, he's trying to take our son," but her husband was already moving. Already pulling out his badge. Not the badge of a police officer. No. This one carried more weight. More power. More consequence. "I'm the director of the Central Intelligence Agency," he said, voice like steel. "Step away from my son. Now. The officer froze. His face, once smug and arrogant, melted into panic. But it was too late. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that he had walked into a trap he had set for himself. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't the first time. This officer had a past. A pattern. A dark web of secrets tied to babies, hospitals, and lies that stretched across years and states. He wasn't just racist. He was criminal. And his crimes were about to surface in a way he never imagined. Because the man he tried to rob had been watching him for months. The humiliation, the betrayal, the horror of almost losing her son, that wasn't going to end in that hospital room. No. That moment was only the beginning. What followed would unravel a system. A cover-up. A network of corruption so embedded that it reached beyond local police departments and into something far more sinister. But that night? That moment in the hospital room? That was the first time someone stood up and said enough. That was the night a man who thought he was above the law came face to face with justice. And not the kind that came quietly. The kind that exposed everything. On camera. In court. To the country. Because sometimes, when you try to rip a child from his mother's arms, you have no idea who's waiting on the other side of that door. But there's one question that no one could answer. One mystery that even the CIA chief himself didn't see coming. Why was that officer so desperate to steal that baby? Why him? Why her? Why now? And when that answer comes, it changes everything. Stay until the end. You'll want to hear this. Before we begin, here's a quick but important message to our black viewers. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in justice, in truth, and in using stories like this one to expose injustice and inspire change. If you've ever felt unseen or disrespected, this story is for you. Your voice matters. Your life matters. Your story matters. Enjoy the journey. And don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more powerful stories like this one. Now, let's begin. Detroit, Michigan. A city full of contrast, grit and resilience woven tightly into its bones, pain and pride living side by side. Skyscrapers reaching skyward while certain neighborhoods remain forgotten, hollowed by decades of injustice. It's in one of those neighborhoods, tucked between the echo of sirens and the constant hum of survival, that Marcus Holloway built his foundation. Raised in a two-bedroom apartment above a barbershop, Marcus learned early that respect wasn't given, it had to be earned, and in his world, that meant navigating life with your head high and your heart guarded. His mother, Clarice, worked 2 jobs, nurse by day, janitor by night, and still made it to every parent-teacher conference. His father had disappeared before Marcus turned 7. No calls. No explanations. Just gone. That silence became a familiar shadow in Marcus's life, one he learned to turn into fuel. But Marcus was different. Even as a boy, people said there was something in his eyes, sharp, focused, like he could see the layers beneath what people said. He didn't just ask questions, he dissected answers. While other kids ran through the streets playing tag, Marcus was the one watching from the steps, calculating, learning. By the time he reached high school, he was already tutoring classmates in physics and helping teachers with administrative work after school. He had a mind that didn't rest. But more than that, he had something rare, he knew how to play the long game. That mindset carried him to college, then law enforcement training, then straight into federal operations. He rose faster than most, not because he played politics, but because he couldn't be ignored. By 30, he had already made waves in counterintelligence. By 35, he was in the room with senators and black budget operations. And by 40, Marcus Holloway had become the youngest black director the CIA had ever appointed. His name whispered in halls with respect, and sometimes fear. His presence commanded silence. His mind, sharp as ever, had learned to walk through lies like they were made of glass. But Marcus wasn't just a man of suits and strategy. Beneath that bulletproof exterior lived a heart molded by abandonment and injustice. It was the same heart that fell hard for Camille. Camille Owens was nothing like the people in Marcus's world. A civil rights attorney known for never backing down, she met Marcus during a federal hearing in D.C., where she was publicly dismantling a police department's corrupt policies. He watched her from the back of the courtroom, stunned by her fire, her clarity, her refusal to be silenced. She didn't care who she was up against. Her voice was unwavering. Her eyes didn't blink. And when she stepped off that stand, Marcus knew something in his life had just changed. They were opposites in the best ways. She challenged him. She grounded him. He protected her. He believed in her. They were a storm and an anchor, fire and logic, and over time, that balance became a home. After 2 years, they married in a small ceremony by the Detroit River. No press, no extravagance, just friends, music, and a quiet promise between two people who had spent their whole lives proving they were more than what the world expected of them. They moved into a townhouse just outside the city, where the noise of the past could fade just enough for them to dream. And when Camille found out she was pregnant, everything slowed down. For once, life was soft. Marcus, the man known for his relentless discipline, melted at every sonogram, every little flutter of a kick. He talked to her belly like it could hear him, telling their son stories of power, dignity, and pride. Camille would laugh, calling him Agent Daddy, and he would smile in ways the CIA had never seen. They planned everything. A private delivery suite. Security detail. Trusted medical staff. Camille's OBGYN had been with her since her first case. No risks. No compromises. Not with their child. Not in this world. They both knew too much about how the system worked, how bias could hide in plain sight, how mistakes with black patients often weren't mistakes at all. That's why Marcus set everything in motion: background checks on the hospital team, cameras discreetly placed, communication protocols ready. Paranoia, some might call it. But for Marcus, it was preparation. Because men like him didn't get the luxury of blind trust. Then came the night. Camille's water broke at 3:17 a.m. The ride to the hospital was calm but urgent. Marcus kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other on hers. She gripped it tightly, pain sharp and fast, but her eyes never wavered. This was their moment. Hours passed. The labor was difficult. Complications emerged. A decision was made. Cesarean. Camille was exhausted, but when they placed their son in her arms, she whispered his name with trembling joy. Marcus stood beside her, speechless, his hands on both of them, as if anchoring the three of them to that room, to that moment, to the reality that for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting a system, he was simply a father. That night, Marcus barely slept. He stayed by Camille's bedside, eyes darting between his wife and son, heart still racing. The next morning, Camille encouraged him to step out briefly, just to get coffee, something to eat. "We're safe," she said. "You did everything. You can breathe now." And against his better judgment, he nodded and left, only for a moment. That was all it took. Because systems don't sleep. And evil doesn't knock. When Officer Travis Landon entered that hospital room, he did it like he belonged. With the confidence of someone who'd worn the uniform long enough to know that most people won't question authority, especially in a place like that, and especially not against a woman who, in his eyes, had no power. Travis had spent years building a reputation on fear and manipulation. He wasn't the loudest, or the most obviously dangerous, but he knew the codes. He knew how to slip past eyes. How to twist policies. How to falsify paperwork. How to speak with a calm tone while doing the cruelest things. But this time, his steps took him into the wrong room. Or maybe, in his mind, it was the right one. A black woman, alone, drugged, barely recovering from major surgery. A newborn in the room. No security in sight. Just a vulnerable body and a child. He walked in and didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask permission. He didn't verify identity. He didn't explain his presence. He simply acted. Because he believed she wouldn't fight back. Or if she did, no one would believe her. He'd seen it happen 100 times. File a report. Disappear the evidence. Blame confusion. Move on. Camille knew better. Her instincts screamed before her voice did. Her body still weak, stitches pulling at her skin, but the fire in her didn't care. She screamed. Loud. Reaching for her son. Pleading with the nurse who stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of who to listen to. Camille's words cracked through the sterile air, "He's trying to steal my baby. Someone help me." But the badge spoke louder than her voice. The uniform drowned her cries. Even the nurse hesitated, torn between a screaming mother and a composed white officer flashing credentials. Camille watched the nurse look to the officer for guidance. She saw it. The doubt. The disbelief. The betrayal. It was in that split second, as Travis wrapped his fingers around the bassinet, beginning to wheel it toward the door, that something shifted. Something primal erupted in her. Pain forgotten. Fear replaced by rage. She forced herself up, nearly collapsing, tearing at the fore in her arm, shouting for her husband with everything she had. And somewhere in the hallway, Marcus heard it. The voice of his wife. Raw. Terrified. Calling his name. He didn't hesitate. Because Marcus Holloway hadn't built a life protecting the country just to lose the one thing that mattered most in a hospital hallway. He ran. Fast. Through the corridors, past stunned staff, knocking over a cart. He didn't care. The scene that awaited him when he threw that door open would scar itself into his memory forever. But it would also ignite something far more powerful than fear. And the man who had stepped into that hospital room with arrogance had no idea who was standing on the other side of that threshold. Not just a husband. Not just a father. But a man with more power than he could comprehend. A man who would dismantle everything. Brick by brick. Lie by lie. And as the pieces begin to fall, one truth will become impossible to ignore: what happened in that room was not random. And someone, somewhere, wanted that baby for a reason. But why? And who? That's what no one saw coming. Camille's voice still echoed in Marcus's ears long after he had stormed into the room. The adrenaline hadn't fully settled, and his hands, still clenched into fists, were only now beginning to relax. Travis Landon stood frozen in place, caught mid-action like a thief paralyzed by a spotlight. The nurse looked between the two men, her confusion thick in the air. The baby whimpered softly in the bassinet, unaware of the tension that had exploded like a landmine in that sterile hospital room. Marcus approached slowly, his badge already in his hand, his eyes burning through the man who had just tried to shatter the core of his world. The words came out sharp, controlled, but every syllable dripped with rage. He demanded identification. Credentials. A reason. Anything. Travis fumbled. He wasn't prepared for this. His mouth moved faster than his mind, spewing fragments of a half-baked lie about a miscommunication from the department, an urgent transfer request due to a health concern, a protocol he claimed was signed off by higher-ups. But his voice lacked conviction. His hands trembled slightly. And Marcus saw right through it. He stepped closer, the air between them heavy with something unspoken. Camille, despite her condition, was sitting up now, eyes locked on the man who had dared to touch her child. Her voice cracked again, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was fury. She demanded answers too. She asked why a uniformed officer had come into her room unannounced, without paperwork, without any medical staff present, and attempted to take her newborn son. Travis tried to pivot, to deflect, to regain control. But Marcus wasn't having it. He called security. Then he called internal affairs. But more importantly, he made another call, one not bound by hospital walls or local jurisdiction. He contacted a secure line that triggered a series of silent flags deep within the CIA's systems. Not because he was using agency resources for personal matters, but because Marcus had learned a long time ago that when someone like Travis Landon shows up in your life, it's never just coincidence. The hospital staff scrambled once authority became undeniable. The head nurse arrived. Then the director of the maternity wing. Apologies were offered in whispers, trembling hands tried to smooth over the chaos, and Travis was asked to leave pending investigation. But even as he walked out under scrutiny, his face betrayed something Marcus couldn't ignore, not fear, not guilt, but calculation. Travis knew something. He wasn't just reckless. He was deliberate. And the way he looked back before exiting said one thing: this wasn't over. Camille was transferred to a secure recovery suite. Armed security was placed at the door, not for show, but because Marcus had seen enough to know that this was no ordinary breach. He spent the next few hours reviewing hospital security footage, making quiet calls, pulling up departmental records, and scanning through every file he could access on Travis Landon. What he found didn't sit right. Landon's record was spotless, too spotless. Every complaint ever filed against him had been dismissed. Witness testimonies mysteriously retracted. Internal reviews all closed with vague conclusions. It was textbook. Someone had been protecting him for years. That night, as Camille held their son close, Marcus sat by her side, silent. She asked him what he was thinking, and he hesitated before answering. Not because he didn't know, but because he knew too much. He looked at her and said, "This wasn't random, Cam. This wasn't some rogue cop making a stupid decision. He knew where to go. He knew you were alone. He knew the baby was here. This was planned." Camille's jaw tightened, her grip around the baby shifting slightly. Her voice was low when she asked, "You think someone sent him?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He simply looked away. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus activated an internal team, off the books. Former analysts. Trusted operatives. People who owed him favors and believed in justice over protocol. They began digging. Hospital records, staff rotations, access logs. Surveillance footage from every wing of the building. Patterns began to emerge. Landon had been in and out of the hospital 3 times in the past month. No official calls. No logged incidents. Just visits. Each time, unannounced. Each time, coinciding with the births of black or biracial infants. Marcus's stomach turned. Camille insisted on being involved. Despite recovering from surgery, she was back on her laptop, compiling legal angles, reviewing policy breaches, and drafting statements. But as she dug deeper, something came up that neither of them expected. An anonymous tip, buried in a police misconduct forum, referenced a quiet program from 5 years ago, an experimental initiative allegedly aimed at placement adjustments for newborns born to at-risk families. It was denied by every public official. No records remained. But whispers persisted. They needed proof. Marcus knew that whatever was happening, it ran deep. Landon wasn't acting alone. And the target hadn't just been their son, it was the idea of who their son represented. A child born from power and resistance. A child born into both intelligence and activism. A child that someone, somewhere, didn't want to exist. The tension escalated when Landon filed a report accusing Marcus of abuse of power. Claimed he was harassed, intimidated, that the CIA director had launched a personal vendetta. The media got wind of it. Articles began circulating. High-ranking CIA official accused of threatening local police officer. Marcus's name, once synonymous with honor, was suddenly being thrown into headlines soaked with doubt. Commentators speculated. Political opponents salivated. The agency went quiet. Too quiet. And Camille watched it unfold with growing fury. They were being painted as the aggressors. As if Camille hadn't been the one attacked. As if Marcus hadn't stopped a crime. As if truth didn't matter. One night, as they sat together in their living room, Camille broke down. She looked at Marcus, tears streaming, and whispered, "They're trying to erase what happened. They want us to question ourselves." Marcus took her hands and promised her that no matter how far this went, no matter how high it reached, he would uncover it. All of it. What neither of them expected came the next morning. A knock on the door. Not reporters. Not police. An envelope. No name. No return address. Inside, a single photo. A baby. Not theirs. A hospital record attached. Different hospital. Different city. No known parents. And a note, he wasn't the first. Marcus stared at the paper for a long time. Camille whispered, "Then who was?" And in that moment, something shifted. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just about Landon. It wasn't just about them. It was bigger. Darker. And someone had just dared them to keep looking. Now the question was, would they be ready for what they were about to find? Rain hit the windshield like static as Marcus sat alone in his car, parked across from the nursing home listed on the file they'd received. The photo still burned in his mind, the baby who wasn't theirs, the silent message left in that unmarked envelope. The note had haunted him for days, not just for what it said, but for what it implied. He wasn't the first. That meant there were others. That meant there was a system. And systems, Marcus knew, didn't exist without architects. He looked down at the ID badge clipped to his jacket. Officially, he was still CIA director. Unofficially, he was operating outside every sanctioned protocol he'd ever sworn to uphold. But this wasn't about duty. This was personal. He looked across the parking lot, eyes narrowing on the figure stepping out of the nursing home's side entrance, an older man with a cane, dressed in civilian clothes, but with posture that told Marcus everything. Military. Retired. Not just someone who watched, someone who had moved pieces. Inside the building, the smell of disinfectant and coffee lingered in the air. Marcus moved with purpose through the hallways, unnoticed by the staff who had already been cleared through his quiet sweep the night before. He approached room 214, knocked once, then pushed the door open. The man looked up slowly. Gray hair, sharp eyes, a long scar that cut across his right cheek like punctuation on a sentence he never got to finish. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Took you long enough." Marcus closed the door behind him. "You left the photo." The man nodded. "I needed you to see it for yourself." "Why?" Marcus asked, voice low, measured, coiled like a spring. "Because I knew no one else would believe it unless someone like you was the one to bring it to the surface." Marcus stepped closer. "You worked with him." "Landon." The man exhaled, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water. "I recruited him. Years ago. He was never supposed to end up like this. But somewhere along the way, we lost track of what the mission was." Marcus didn't flinch. "What mission?" The man hesitated. Then, slowly, it started as a psychological experiment. Private contractors. The theory was, if you could identify behavioral predictors in infancy, you could shape future outcomes. Redirect children born into high-risk environments before they fell into the system. Redirect them early enough, and they'd never end up in the pipeline. On paper, it sounded like preventative social work. But in practice, it became something else. Marcus's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You were taking babies." "No," the man corrected, "we were reassigning them." Families were compensated. Records sealed. The logic was clean: better future, fewer risks. The government looked the other way because it aligned with budget cuts and performance metrics. No one asked questions. And they were all black. Marcus demanded, the bile rising in his throat. Mostly, the man admitted. But not always. Race wasn't the only factor. But it made things easier. The assumptions. The bias. The doubt. You know how it works. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. And Landon? He went off script, the man said bitterly. Started making decisions on his own. No clearance. No oversight. We tried to shut it down, but he had built a web. Blackmail. Compromised people in hospitals. And by the time we knew what he was doing, it was too late. He was choosing children based on his own criteria. One of your analysts tried to dig into it a few years ago. She disappeared. Silence filled the room like fog. Marcus's voice came out colder than the air around them. Why come to me now? The man looked up, old guilt etched deep in his eyes. Because your son was going to be the first high-profile child. A statement. Not just another baby. A symbol. Someone sent Landon with a purpose. He wasn't freelancing this time. He was executing an order. The words landed heavy. Marcus didn't speak. He turned and walked out, each step louder than the last. The moment the door clicked behind him, he dialed Camille. Back at home, Camille had been following her own leads. The file she pulled from an anonymous source earlier that morning had contained hospital names, dates, and a spreadsheet full of numbers that didn't make sense, until they did. She sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her son asleep beside her in a baby carrier, breathing softly. When Marcus's voice came through the phone, she already knew. They've been doing it for years, he said. And they were going to use our son to make it public, she whispered. Marcus was already on his way home. Not anymore. Later that night, a press conference was scheduled in Detroit. Landon's department was hosting an officer recognition ceremony for community engagement. Cameras would be there. Reporters. Officials. The perfect platform. Camille looked at Marcus and asked, "Are you sure you want to do this live?" "Yes," he replied. "It needs to be seen." The auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Landon stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his smile rehearsed. He spoke about trust, about rebuilding relationships with the community. He talked about new policies, about transparency. And then, just as the applause began, the back doors opened. Marcus entered, flanked by 2 federal agents. The room fell silent. He walked straight up the aisle, no rush, no hesitation, and climbed onto the stage. Landon's face twitched. "What is this?" Landon asked, still smiling. Marcus didn't smile back. "You want transparency," he said into the microphone. "Let's start with the truth." He pulled out a flash drive. "Behind me is Officer Travis Landon. Praised for his community work. But what if I told you he's connected to at least 7 undocumented removals of newborns from hospitals across 3 states? What if I showed you footage, dates, patterns, names?" Gasps echoed through the crowd. "I have proof," Marcus continued. "And I will release it. Not just to you, but to every media outlet in this country." Landon stepped forward. "You're out of line." "I'm not here as a director," Marcus said. "I'm here as a father." Landon's jaw clenched. "You think they'll believe you?" Marcus held up the flash drive. "They don't have to believe me. They just have to press play." Behind them, a projector lit up. Footage played. Hospital corridors. Landon's face. Newborn units. Dates. Times. The room erupted. Reporters shouted. Officials scrambled. Landon turned to run, but the federal agents closed in. Camille stood in the back, arms crossed, watching justice begin to unfurl. A reporter approached her. "Why now?" he asked. "Why speak out now?" She looked at him, calm and unshaken. "Because no one listened when we whispered. So now we're making them listen when we scream." But even as the flashbulbs went off and Landon was led away, Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Because the question still remained, who gave the order? And why did they want his son? Marcus stood at the edge of the stage long after Landon was dragged out, the murmurs in the auditorium still rising and falling like crashing waves. The footage continued to loop silently behind him, playing out in chilling detail the very evidence that dismantled every carefully polished lie the department had fed the public for years. Yet his mind wasn't on the crowd anymore. It wasn't on the flash drives or the press or the faces of disbelief. It was on the silence that followed. The kind of silence that comes when something deeper still hides in the shadows. He stepped down from the stage, walked past the stunned reporters and officials, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. He had pulled the curtain on the puppet, but he hadn't yet found the hand that moved the strings. Back at the house, Camille sat on the couch in the dim light, arms wrapped around their baby, her eyes flickering over the documents now scattered across the coffee table. She hadn't said much since Marcus called to tell her Landon was arrested. Her relief was quiet. Almost too quiet. Marcus entered the room and sat beside her without speaking. The baby stirred softly against her chest. For a long while, they just sat there, the silence between them heavy, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had changed. Finally, she broke it. Her voice was soft, but filled with weight. She said she kept thinking about all the other mothers. The ones who didn't have a husband with connections. The ones who screamed and no one heard them. The ones whose babies were taken and were never seen again. Her eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back. She wasn't crying out of weakness. She was angry. Furious. And she couldn't shake one question: why their son? Marcus leaned forward, rubbing his hands together, searching for something that would make sense. Landon wasn't acting alone, he said finally. He was following a directive. He was hand-picked for this. That means someone else gave the order. Someone who knew where you'd be. Someone who had access to the hospital, the delivery schedule, even our personal files. Camille looked up slowly, and Marcus continued. There's a mole. Inside the agency. The words hung in the air like a fuse waiting for a spark. Camille's lips parted, and her voice came out colder now. She asked how long he'd suspected it. Marcus hesitated. Since the first day I joined the agency, he said. You don't get this far without realizing the rot isn't just in law enforcement. It's everywhere. The deeper you go, the more it stinks. She asked what he planned to do. And he answered her the only way he knew how: burn it down. All of it. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus shut everything down. He went dark, disconnected all official agency lines, disabled access to their home servers, pulled Camille and the baby into a safe house known only to 2 people on Earth. He called in one last favor from an old field contact who owed him his life, a surveillance expert who specialized in digital fingerprints. They began tracing the chain of command behind Landon's activity: payment trails, data signatures, hidden servers cloaked behind dummy corporations. And slowly, the net tightened. It led them to a name Marcus hadn't thought about in years: Deputy Director Howard Latch. A man revered within the agency. Publicly spotless. Privately elusive. Latch had once mentored Marcus early in his career, taught him how to navigate the politics of the agency, how to play the long game. But there had always been something in his advice that rang hollow. Something rehearsed. Latch was the kind of man who never got his hands dirty, not directly. He was the architect who designed the plans and let others hammer in the nails. Marcus remembered an old quote Latch once told him, "The key to control isn't power. It's making others believe they chose it." Late that night, Marcus met him at a private location, an underground parking structure where whispers traveled slower than bullets. Latch was waiting, leaning against a black sedan, arms folded, his eyes calm as always. Marcus walked slowly, each step echoing beneath the concrete ceiling. No agents. No backup. Just two men who knew too much about each other. "You made quite the scene," Latch said, almost with amusement. "Did you forget what game we're playing?" Marcus stopped 3 feet from him. "This isn't a game. You sent Landon after my family." Latch raised a brow, the corner of his mouth twitching with faint irritation. "You think I'd waste someone like Landon on something as petty as revenge? Please. You give him too much credit." "Then tell me why," Marcus demanded. "Why target my son?" Latch's expression hardened. "Because your child is a symbol. A threat. A convergence of power that can't be allowed to grow unchecked. Do you know what happens when people like you reproduce with women like her? You create legends. Movements. That baby wasn't just a baby. He's a statement. And we can't afford statements we don't write ourselves." Marcus felt the heat crawl up his spine, but he kept his voice cold. "You're afraid." Latch stepped closer. "I'm strategic. There's a difference. Your loyalty was never to the agency, it was to justice. And justice is unpredictable. It doesn't serve power. It dismantles it. You created a program to disappear babies," Marcus said, voice cracking now. "To rewrite families. To erase potential. You did that." "I authorized a contingency," Latch said. "You called it an abduction. I called it prevention." "They weren't yours to take," Marcus snapped. "No," Latch agreed. "But no one stopped me. Until now." The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, Marcus pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A live signal blinked red. "Everything you just said was recorded." Latch didn't flinch. "And who's going to believe it?" Marcus met his gaze. "Everyone. Because I'm not hiding anymore." He turned and walked away, each step reverberating like a countdown. Behind him, Latch stood still, breathing heavier now. The empire he built, the lies he orchestrated, all crumbling. When Marcus returned to the safe house, Camille was waiting at the door, holding the baby against her chest. He looked at them and said, "It's done. We have everything we need." She nodded, but her eyes searched his face. "Are you okay?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her, and whispered, "I wasn't. But I will be." The next morning, the files were released. To the press. To Congress. To the world. Footage. Documents. Audio recordings. A map of manipulation that spanned decades. And at the center, a single name, Howard Latch. The agency tried to contain it, but the leak was too vast, the damage too deep. Investigations were launched. Officials resigned. Families came forward. Lawsuits were filed. A movement was born. And through it all, Marcus and Camille stood firm. They had uncovered a legacy of stolen futures. But they had protected theirs. Now the world was watching. And the question that remained, how many more children were never found? And how long had silence been mistaken for peace? The leak had detonated like a slow-burning bomb. In the hours that followed its release, the world remained frozen, holding its collective breath as truth, long buried beneath bureaucracy and silence, surfaced with sharp edges and blood-stained roots. National networks interrupted programming with breaking news updates, reporters fumbling through names and files they barely understood, anchors trying to process words like unauthorized reassignments and government-sanctioned identity manipulation. The public reeled. Protests ignited outside courthouses and federal buildings, not just in Detroit, but across the country. Former hospital workers stepped forward with statements. Whistleblowers from agencies that had once played supporting roles now scrambled to distance themselves, to rewrite their own involvement. And amid the chaos, Marcus Holloway sat in a small office inside a community center in West Detroit, face lit only by the pale blue glow of a laptop, watching it all unfold with a strange calm in his chest, not peace, not relief, but something harder. Like the stillness after a storm when the damage can finally be counted. Camille walked in quietly, holding a printed copy of a newly surfaced email chain. It outlined covert communication between hospital administrators and a security consulting firm tied to Latcha's private accounts, evidence of complicity stretching beyond what they had originally uncovered. She placed the papers on the desk without a word. Marcus didn't even look up. His fingers were still moving, drafting a statement for an upcoming hearing. He hadn't slept in over 36 hours, and yet fatigue hadn't touched him. What gripped him now wasn't adrenaline or vengeance, it was obligation. Not to the agency. Not to politics. To truth. To history. To the babies whose names never made it to records. To the parents who buried grief in silence. To his son, who would one day grow old enough to ask, "Why did they want me?" Camille finally broke the silence. She told him that the New York Times had scheduled a full-length exposé. That the House Intelligence Committee was calling for a federal inquiry. That Howard Latch had been placed under house arrest but had not yet spoken to the press. That his lawyers were already shaping him into a scapegoat. A lone wolf. An anomaly. She was furious. Her voice cracked with the weight of it. They wanted to make it seem like this was one man's crime. But it wasn't. It was a network. A design. She asked Marcus how they could ensure the story didn't lose its sharpness. How they could keep people from forgetting once the headlines faded. Marcus looked up at her, and something in his eyes shifted. He asked her if she still had the recordings of her interviews with families, mothers and fathers who had reached out in the last few days, pouring out stories of confusion, lost documentation, children who disappeared after birth and were never mentioned again. Camille nodded. She had hours of them, all anonymous, all unfiltered. She thought they'd use them in court. But Marcus had another idea. They wouldn't just bring them into courtrooms. They'd bring them to the world. He proposed a documentary. A platform where survivors could speak, uncut, uninterrupted. He told her the most dangerous thing to the people in power wasn't exposure, it was humanization. Letting people see the pain. Hear the heartbreak. Understand that these weren't statistics. They were names. Faces. Legacies that were stolen or nearly erased. As the plan took shape, Marcus found himself sitting across from agency officials more than once. He was still technically a federal employee, though the CIA had quietly stripped him of active clearance and privileges. They hadn't fired him, yet. Instead, they did what institutions do best when threatened, they stalled. They opened internal reviews, buried motions in red tape, tried to distract the public with statements of cooperation while internally trying to contain the fallout. Marcus refused to play along. He showed up to every hearing. He spoke plainly. He laid out timelines, pointed out inconsistencies, named names. But behind closed doors, he faced a new kind of pressure, a quiet war, fought with veiled warnings. One of the senior board members, an older woman who had once mentored him, invited him to lunch. The meeting was polite, professional, but loaded with unspoken meaning. She told him there were things he didn't understand. That what he exposed wasn't just about children. That the program, though immoral, had been connected to national security projections, long-term surveillance strategies, even foreign relations. She warned him that dismantling it completely could trigger international instability. She used the phrase, greater good, more than once. Marcus listened carefully. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. But when she said, "You've made your point, now let us handle it from here," he responded with the quietest and most dangerous sentence of his life. He said, "If you try to bury this, I'll make sure the whole world knows what's underneath." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Still, the weight of everything began to press in. At night, Marcus lay awake, watching the ceiling, listening to the soft breaths of his son in the crib across the room. Camille had taken to sleeping lightly, waking often, her body still wound-tight from the trauma of nearly losing everything. They were safe now, yes. But safety had changed its shape. It wasn't something they could hold. It was something they had to build, moment by moment, one decision at a time. And it came with a cost. Friends turned distant. Some colleagues refused to return calls. His mother called from Georgia, saying people were asking questions, wondering why his name was on the news. She supported him, but she was afraid. Afraid of what came next. Afraid that the truth didn't just set people free, it made them targets. One evening, Camille sat down beside Marcus with a question that stopped him cold. She asked him if he ever thought he'd made a mistake joining the agency. If maybe, all those years of chasing truth through the corridors of power had only led him into a deeper kind of trap. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then at their son, then back down at his hands. He said he used to believe he could change the system from the inside. That if he just worked harder, climbed higher, earned enough respect, he could force it to evolve. But now, he wasn't sure the system had ever been broken. He said maybe it had always worked exactly the way it was designed to protect itself. To exploit. To hide behind rules and titles and phrases like national security. Camille listened, her eyes glassy, her fingers curled around his. Then she asked, "So what now?" It was the right question. Because while justice had started to move, the machine hadn't stopped. Latch still hadn't confessed. Charges were being brought against Landon, but a legal team funded by private donors was already working to get his case dismissed on technicalities. And most damning of all, new evidence had surfaced, hinting that this wasn't just a national issue. There were whispers of a global database, coordinated child tracking systems under different names in different countries, all tied to a shadow budget buried deep in UN reports. What Marcus and Camille had uncovered might have been the tip of an iceberg, and the deeper truth was colder than anything they'd expected. Marcus sat in his office late one night, watching security feeds, his body still, his mind restless. He thought about leaving. Taking Camille and the baby and disappearing. Starting over somewhere quiet. But he couldn't. Not after everything. Not with what they knew. He thought about the baby in that photo. About the other babies. About the names he hadn't yet uncovered. He thought about the lives altered forever without consent, without trace. And he realized the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Because now the world knew. And now the world had to decide, what would it do with the truth? The storm outside mirrored the one still brewing inside Marcus's chest. The media firestorm had begun to settle into long-form analysis, panel debates, and think pieces. The public had taken its sides, some calling him a hero, others accusing him of destabilizing national confidence. But none of that mattered when he looked into his wife's eyes each night and saw the exhaustion sitting there like permanent weight. Camille had been quiet lately, not from fear but from the emotional saturation of living day after day inside a wound that never seemed to close. Her strength had never been in question, but Marcus could feel it now, the need for rest, for peace, for just one moment of stillness without looking over their shoulders or reliving what almost happened in that hospital room. They had returned to their home in Detroit under federal protection, with surveillance systems upgraded by Marcus's former tech contacts and every angle of the house covered. The baby had started sleeping more regularly, a small mercy in a life that had lost its rhythm. But neither of them had returned to normal. Not really. There were still calls in the middle of the night from families who had seen the broadcasts and wondered if what had happened to the Holloways had happened to them too. Camille listened to each voice, took notes, cried quietly when no one was looking, and archived everything. Some of the mothers had long suspected something had gone wrong with their births. A few had been told their babies had died during delivery, only to have hospital staff refuse to produce death certificates. Others had been coerced into giving up custody with threats of arrest or fabricated drug test results. One woman shared that her daughter, now a teenager, had only recently discovered her adoption had been arranged through a private firm linked to a retired federal contractor. The stories weren't isolated anymore, they were patterns. Marcus watched Camille absorb the weight of those calls, and each time he asked her if she wanted to stop, she said no. She couldn't stop now. If they stopped, the silence would return. And silence, they both understood, was the oxygen that allowed this kind of evil to breathe. A week after the documentary trailer was released, Marcus received a call he didn't expect. It was Latch. Or rather, Latch's legal team, requesting a private meeting, off record, no cameras, no recordings, no statements. Marcus hesitated. Camille was against it at first. She argued that any conversation with him would give Latch the chance to manipulate the narrative. But Marcus said something that changed her mind. He said, if the person who started all of this wants to talk, that means he's afraid of how it ends. The meeting was arranged in a secure location, an unused courthouse room under supervision from a third-party legal observer. When Marcus walked in, he found Latch seated at the far end of a long table, no cuffs, no uniform, just the same arrogant calmness he had always worn like a tailored suit. His hair was grayer, his eyes less certain, but his posture still carried the weight of someone who believed he could control the terms of a conversation. Marcus sat across from him, said nothing at first, just looked at him, let the silence wrap around the room like wire. It was Latch who spoke first. He said he wanted to negotiate. He said the agency was preparing to offer a quiet resolution, early retirement, sealed proceedings, full immunity in exchange for cooperation and detailed disclosures. He claimed it was a win-win. The country could move forward. No more chaos. No more headlines. Marcus stared at him for a long time, then asked, "Do you know how many families have come forward?" Latch didn't answer. Marcus continued, his voice low and deliberate. "Do you understand that this isn't just about one directive or one department? You created a system that erased children from history." Latch's eyes flicked downward, then back up. He leaned forward slightly and said something Marcus wasn't expecting. He said, "You think I'm the beginning. But I'm not." Marcus's chest tightened. Latch went on, explaining that the project had roots that stretched back decades, beyond his time. He wasn't the architect. He was a caretaker. He inherited the system, fine-tuned it, covered its tracks. But it had existed long before him. Marcus asked why. Why target black children? Why engineer something so monstrous? Latch replied without flinching. Because they knew no one would believe their mothers. Because the system was already designed not to listen to them. We just used what was already broken. Marcus sat back, the words hitting him like ice water. He asked if there were others still operating. Latch nodded. He said there were still doctors, administrators, agents, some retired, some still active, people who had seen this as a necessary evil. People who believed that they were shaping the future by controlling who got to have one. Latch claimed he had names. But he wanted something in return. Anonymity. Immunity. Protection. When Marcus returned home, Camille was waiting in the kitchen. He told her everything. Her hands were clenched around a tea mug, her body still, her eyes searching his face as he explained the depth of it, the scale. She didn't speak for a while. Then she asked, "If you give him what he wants, what do we lose?" Marcus looked down. The chance to see him punished publicly. Camille nodded. Then she said something he hadn't considered. Maybe the punishment isn't about him. Maybe it's about the truth reaching the ones who need it. The next day, Marcus made his decision. He took Latch's deal, but only under one condition: full testimony, on the record, before a special counsel, with a full list of names and documented links to every participating hospital, agency, and private contractor. The deal was accepted. And the testimony began. For days, Marcus and Camille sat in the gallery, listening to the man who nearly destroyed their lives explain, in clinical detail, how the system had been constructed, maintained, and hidden. He named politicians, judges, CEOs. Not all of them still living. Some were now high-profile advocates for reform. Some had built their careers on speeches about equality. The hypocrisy was almost unbearable. But the world listened. And the more Latch spoke, the harder it became to deny. After one particularly long session, Marcus and Camille returned to their car, sat in the parking lot in silence. The baby slept in the back seat, unaware of the burden being lifted, piece by piece, from the world he would grow up in. Camille looked at Marcus and asked if he ever thought any of this would matter. If any of it would really change things. Marcus looked at their son in the mirror and said, "It already has." But even as they sat there, the next dilemma was already rising in their minds. Now that the truth was out, what did justice look like? Was it prison for the guilty? Was it reparation for the families? Was it system reform? Or was it something deeper, something less measurable, something that required a complete transformation of how the world valued certain lives over others? They didn't have the answer yet. But they were willing to find it. What they didn't know was that someone else had been watching the hearings too. A young intern working at a nonprofit in D.C., someone who had been adopted in the early 2000s and had never fully believed the story she'd been told about her birth. She watched the footage of Camille, eyes full of conviction, voice unshaken. She saw Marcus stand beside her, steady and protective. And something inside her clicked. She reached out. Sent a message. Included a name. A date. A hospital. Camille read the email 3 times before she called Marcus. He picked up after the first ring. She didn't say anything at first. Then her voice broke through, and she whispered, "I think we found one." And just like that, the story wasn't ending. It was expanding. Marcus sat in the back seat of the black SUV, fingers tapping restlessly on his knee as the city passed by in slow fragments outside the window. The email from the young woman in D.C. replayed over and over in his mind, each word echoing like a drumbeat just beneath his skin. Her message had been brief, but every sentence carried the kind of weight only someone standing at the edge of truth could carry. She had been adopted in 2002 from a private clinic in Atlanta. Her mother was told she had died during childbirth. But a slip, an overheard conversation, a mismatched birth certificate, had haunted her since she was 15. Now she was 23, and the headlines about Marcus and Camille's story had hit her like lightning. She had followed every thread, watched every testimony, taken screenshots of court documents, and when Latch started naming facilities used for the reassignments, she saw the name of the clinic where she had been born. Something cracked inside her. She hadn't been able to breathe right since. She said she didn't know for sure if she was one of the children, but if there was even a chance, she needed help to find out who she was. Who her mother had been. Who she was supposed to be. Camille sat beside Marcus, holding a manila folder with the girl's details, emails, timelines, clipped screenshots, and a printed image of her face from a social media profile. She looked young, hopeful, but behind her smile was something that neither of them could ignore, the ache of not knowing. Camille hadn't spoken much since they received the message, but Marcus could feel the way it hit her. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was personal. Camille had carried a child in her arms, knowing what it meant to almost lose him. Now they were looking at a woman who had been taken completely. Camille's voice finally broke the silence in the car, soft but heavy. She said, "If this is real, if she really was taken like that, what does justice even look like for her?" Marcus didn't have an answer. Not yet. They arrived at the nonprofit office just after 6. It was a small, two-story building with a hand-painted mural on the side, faces of women, mothers, daughters, fists raised. Inside, the lights were warm, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air. The young woman was waiting in a corner room, sitting on a worn couch, a notebook clutched tightly in her hands. When she looked up and saw them, her breath caught. Marcus noticed it, the way her eyes filled with recognition and fear and something else, need. Camille smiled first, gently, and sat beside her. Marcus took the armchair across. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the girl said, "My name is Asha. But I don't think that's the name I was born with." Camille nodded slowly and reached for her hand. "We're here to find out the truth, Asha. Whatever it is." Asha told them what little she knew. Her adoptive parents were kind, wealthy, and private. She was raised in the suburbs of Arlington. She had always felt out of place, like something about her life didn't fit. When she turned 18, she requested her adoption records, but they were sealed. The few documents she managed to find were full of redactions. She tried digging into the clinic's history, only to find that it had closed 2 years after her birth, with most of its staff either relocated or mysteriously retired. Then she found a name, Dr. Sylvia Martin, a midwife listed on a medical forum, one of the last remaining people tied to the clinic who hadn't disappeared completely. Marcus took that name and made a call. The next morning, they were on a plane to North Carolina. Dr. Martin lived in a quiet, rural town, hidden behind dense trees and winding roads. Her home was modest, surrounded by wild garden beds and wind chimes. She answered the door slowly, a woman in her 70s, eyes sharp but wary. When Marcus introduced himself, her shoulders tensed. When Camille explained why they were there, she didn't let them in. Instead, she stepped outside, closed the door behind her, and asked, "How many more?" Camille blinked. "How many more what?" Dr. Martin's voice cracked. "How many more children are looking for their mothers?" Marcus stepped forward. "Too many. But we think Asha may be one of them. And you were there. You can help her." The woman looked over at Asha, standing just behind Camille, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Something softened in her eyes then. She said she remembered a baby girl born in early May of 2002. The mother was unconscious during delivery. When she woke, the baby was already gone. The official report said the infant didn't survive. But Dr. Martin had seen the child. Healthy. Breathing. And then gone the next morning. She hadn't spoken about it in years. She said there were others like her, nurses and assistants who had been told to stay quiet or lose their licenses. She herself had been offered a generous retirement package shortly after. She knew what had happened. She just didn't know who had been behind it. Until now. Camille asked her if she remembered the name of the mother. Dr. Martin nodded slowly. Denise Randall. Asha broke down. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Back in Detroit, they worked to find Denise. It didn't take long. She was living in Chicago, working as a janitor at a community college, never remarried, no other children. Camille called her first. She explained what they had found, what Asha had been told. Denise didn't speak. At first, Camille thought the line had dropped. But then she heard the softest whisper, "She's alive." They met 2 days later at a quiet park just outside the city. Denise sat on a bench beneath a canopy of trees, holding a photograph of her newborn, the only one she'd ever had. When Asha approached, Denise stood, shaking, her hands covering her mouth. Asha walked slowly, tears already streaming, and then they were holding each other, sobbing in a way that stripped the years off their bodies. Camille and Marcus stood back, not speaking, not moving. Just bearing witness. Later that evening, in the hotel room, Camille sat on the bed with her head in her hands. Marcus came out of the bathroom, drying his face with a towel, and saw her like that. He sat beside her and asked what she was thinking. She looked up and said, "We can't stop now." Marcus nodded. "I know." She turned to him, her voice raw. "But what if this never ends? What if we just keep finding more stories like Asha's, more mothers, more children? What if the system was so big that it never dies?" Marcus leaned in, took her hand. "Then we keep going. Until we can't. Until there's nothing left to uncover." Camille smiled through her tears. "And if something happens to us?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Then someone else will take the next step." Their mission had evolved. It was no longer about exposing one man or one operation. It had become about giving people their names back. Their families. Their histories. Their humanity. They began assembling a team, legal experts, journalists, genealogists, private investigators. People who believed in truth without compromise. Asha joined the team too. So did Denise. Their voices added power to every case. Every reunion. Every revelation. And in the quiet hours between the chaos, when the world finally slowed for a moment and their son slept safely in his crib, Marcus and Camille would sit beside each other and reflect on the moment everything changed. The moment a racist officer walked into a hospital room and tried to steal a child. A moment that should have broken them. But instead, it built something stronger. Unshakable. A fire that now burned in every family they helped reunite. A fire that could not be put out. Because the truth was no longer a secret. It had become a movement. Months passed, but the storm never truly ended, it transformed. What began as an isolated act of violence inside a hospital room had grown into a reckoning that swept across agencies, institutions, and generations. The movement gained structure. Camille became the co-founder of a national task force that specialized in reuniting families affected by forced infant separations and fraudulent adoptions. She worked with lawmakers to introduce new legislation that required full transparency in hospital birth records, unsealed adoption files by default, and established a federal oversight committee with real teeth. She was no longer just a civil rights attorney, she had become a symbol, a force who held the system accountable not with rage alone, but with law, strategy, and an unshakable sense of moral clarity. And yet, through it all, she remained grounded. Her greatest victories didn't come in courtrooms or on news headlines. They came in quiet reunions, in the arms of mothers holding daughters they never thought they'd see again, in the trembling hands of now-grown men meeting the birth parents they had been stolen from. Asha, who had once only known her name through adoption papers, now stood tall beside her birth mother, Denise. The two had rebuilt their relationship from rawness and honesty, slowly and gently, with late-night phone calls, shared memories, and the delicate weaving of lives once torn apart. Asha had become the voice of a new generation, advocating for others like her, those raised in privilege, but haunted by the knowledge that something had been taken from them without consent. She launched an organization dedicated to genetic tracing and adoption transparency, partnering with DNA databases and tech companies to help other adopted individuals search for their roots. Her story, once shrouded in doubt, now served as a light for countless others walking through the fog of the unknown. Howard Latch, once untouchable, was now living in enforced obscurity. Though he avoided prison time through a controversial immunity deal, his name had been burned into the public consciousness as the man who legalized the unthinkable. No position. No influence. No redemption in the eyes of a nation that now saw him for what he truly was, a quiet architect of destruction. He lived under constant surveillance, his former allies disavowing him, his legacy dismantled piece by piece. Marcus never spoke of him again. He didn't have to. Latch had already been tried in the court of truth, and his sentence would last the rest of his life. As for Travis Landon, the former officer who triggered it all, justice had come swiftly. After his trial, which became one of the most closely followed cases in the country, he was convicted not only for the attempted abduction but for conspiracy, falsifying documents, and his role in multiple coerced removals of newborns. He was sentenced to 45 years without the possibility of parole. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. And the irony was not lost on anyone, his fate sealed by the very system he once exploited, now reformed enough to devour him whole. But the world didn't stop for any of them. It moved forward, changed. The agency Marcus once served underwent a massive internal overhaul. An entirely new leadership team was installed, many recruited from outside the traditional circles, people who had built their careers on transparency and human rights. Marcus was offered his position back, this time with more authority, more reach. He declined. Instead, he chose something better. He launched his own intelligence and accountability organization, privately funded and globally respected, focused on exposing government corruption and covert human rights violations across borders. Camille served as legal counsel. Asha led research initiatives. Together, they created a network of truth-tellers, people who had been burned by silence and were now armed with evidence, voices, and support. And Marcus, through it all, remained a father first. Each morning, he woke up to his son's laughter echoing through the halls of their Detroit home. He watched him grow into a child full of questions, light, and curiosity. And sometimes, when the boy fell asleep in his arms, Marcus would close his eyes and think about the life that could have been, what would have happened if he had arrived at that hospital room just 1 minute later. That thought never left him. It became the fuel for every decision he made, every life he helped rebuild, every lie he helped destroy. One summer afternoon, as Marcus stood beside Camille on the steps of the Capitol after the passing of the Family Restoration Act, a historic bill that guaranteed access to original birth records and criminalized undisclosed adoption trafficking, he looked out at the crowd gathered below. Mothers and daughters. Fathers and sons. Reporters. Lawmakers. Survivors. Faces full of grief and pride. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt something close to peace. Camille squeezed his hand. He looked at her, then down at their son, and smiled. Because in the end, this story wasn't just about what had been taken. It was about what had been reclaimed. The truth. Their names. Their futures. And as the sun set behind them, a quiet sense of justice hung in the air, not perfect, not clean, but real. Earned. Now let's pause for a moment. Think about everything we just walked through together. Not just the facts, but the emotions. The betrayal. The rage. The fear. The resilience. The redemption. Ask yourself, how many times has injustice hidden behind a uniform or a title? How often have stories like these been ignored, denied, erased? And more importantly, how many more are still out there, waiting to be told? What would you do if it were your family? What would you risk to protect your truth? If this story moved you, made you think, made you feel, share it. Talk about it. And most of all, remember it. Because stories like these aren't just entertainment. They're warnings. They're blueprints. They're the voices of people who refuse to be forgotten. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what this story meant to you. We want to hear your voice, because your voice matters. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and unforgettable, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist. Because around here, the truth always finds a way out. We'll see you in the next one.